On Poplar Street, they had a name for Ernie Delgado, and they used it behind his back. The man who left. He was 54, with a firefighter's pension of $3,100 a month, a house he had spent 20 years paying for, and slept in maybe 60 nights a year, and 2 grown daughters who said his first name like a fact about someone else. His wife Samantha had died the spring before he came home for good, and the block turned out for her funeral and not quite for him. At the end of the street stood the old daycare, Little Willows, boarded 2 years, a yellow demolition notice stapled to its door. The back fees came to $1,840. Ernie filed a salvage claim and paid them, mostly to have something to do with his hands. He did not know about the bricked-over wall in the nap room, the welded hatch under the cubbies, or the folder with his own name on it. The notice went up on a Tuesday in the middle of October, and Ernie saw it the way you see a thing you have been not looking at for a long time. He had walked the length of Poplar most mornings since June, out to the end and back, because a man who has spent 20 years sleeping in a firehouse bunk does not know how to stay still inside a quiet house. The house was quiet now in a way it had never been. Samantha was gone. Eliana, who was 17, spent her days at the high school and her evenings in her room with the door not quite closed. The way a girl keeps a door when she is not sure whether she wants you to knock. Alexa, 20, was 3 hours north at the state school and called on Sundays. And when she called, she talked to him carefully, the way you talk to a relative you have decided to forgive, but have not yet finished forgiving. So Ernie walked down past the Vegas's place, where Fernando was always out with the hose in the early cool, coaxing a strip of grass to stay green against a summer that did not want it to. Past Patricia's roses, which had no business surviving in that heat and did anyway. Past the houses with the blinds drawn all day, and the houses with the for sale signs gone gray in the sun, and the 2 houses on the corner that nobody had lived in, for so long the city had chained the gas meters. At the end, where the street gave out into a chain-link fence and a drainage easement, sat Little Willows. It was a low brick building, 1 story, with a flat roof and a covered porch across the front and a hand-painted sign over the door that had once been yellow. A willow tree, painted, its branches trailing down around the words. The paint had gone the color of an old tooth. The windows were boarded with plywood that had itself begun to warp and silver. There was a playground behind a fence to the side, and in the playground a swing set with no swings, just the chains, and a little plastic slide bleached almost white, and grass grown up through the rubber matting until the matting was more idea than fact. Every child on Poplar Street had gone through that door. Ernie knew that the way he knew the street was named for a tree that no longer grew on it. His own girls had gone there, both of them, when they were small. Alexa in the years right after he took the job 3 states away. Eliana in the years after that. Samantha used to walk them down in the morning, and Miss Perla used to be standing on the porch in the early light, and the children would let go of their mother's hands and run at her, and she would catch them, one after another, like a woman catching things thrown down to her from a great height. He remembered that. He remembered it from photographs, mostly. He had been 3 states away. That was the shape of 20 years. A firehouse 3 states east that paid a shift man half again what the city here paid, and a schedule he built himself into a kind of machine so the numbers would work. Out Monday before dawn, a 7-hour drive each way. 48 on and 24 off and 48 on again, sleeping the between shifts in the crew bunk, rather than paying for a room, and then the long drive back Friday night to be a father and a husband, for a day and a half before the machine started over. Samantha had raised the girls. He had sent the money home, and it had covered the house, and it had bought the girls their shoes and their braces and their field trips, and he had told himself, the whole time, that this was what a man did. That love was a wire transfer that cleared on the 1st of the month. He had missed Alexa's first steps and heard about them by phone. He had missed the school plays and seen them on a screen Samantha held up to the camera. He had come home one Friday to find Eliana, who was 3, cry when he picked her up, because at 3 she did not entirely know who he was, and he had handed her back to her mother and gone out to the truck and sat in it for a while in the dark. He had thought, for 20 years, that there was no other way. That was the thing he could not yet see the whole of, standing in front of a yellow notice on a boarded-up door. The yellow notice was new. Ernie stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets and read it twice. Condemned. It said the structure had been deemed a nuisance and a hazard, that the accumulated municipal fees for board-up, weed abatement, and code inspection now stood at $1,840 and no cents, and that unless those fees were satisfied, the city intended to proceed with demolition. And there was a date, and the date was 6 weeks out. Nobody had objected. Ernie was fairly sure of that. A building like this, a poor woman's daycare on a street the young families had run from, went down and nobody wrote a letter. He tried to feel the thing you were supposed to feel, and found instead the flat, familiar pressure he had been carrying around all summer, the sense of standing next to his own life and watching it go on without him. He walked home. He did not decide anything that day, but the notice stayed in his head the way a splinter stays in a palm, and 3 days later he drove down to the municipal building on Alameda, downtown 10 minutes and a whole world from Poplar Street, and he stood in a line under fluorescent lights and asked a woman behind a counter what a person would have to do to keep the city from tearing that building down. The woman was maybe 40, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and she looked at him the way clerks look at a man who is about to make more work for everyone. But she pulled the file. It took her a while. When she came back, she said the property had gone through the abandonment process, the last owner deceased, no heirs come forward, no taxes paid but no taxes really owed, because the assessed value had fallen below the exemption floor years ago, and the only thing standing between the building and the bulldozer was the $1,840 in accumulated fees. You could file a salvage abandonment claim, she said. Pay the fees, take on the liability, and the city releases the structure to you as is. Then it's your problem instead of ours. She said it not unkindly. Most people don't. It's cheaper to let us knock it down. Who was the last owner? Ernie said. The clerk looked at the file. Escobedo, she said. Perla Escobedo, she's been dead 2 years. She turned a page. Ran a daycare there, looks like. 40 years. She said it the way you'd read the weather in another state. Ernie stood there under the lights. 40 years. He did the arithmetic without meaning to. 40 years ago, he had been 14, and Perla Escobedo had already been the woman on the porch. The woman his own mother left him with in the afternoons before the daycare was even a daycare. When it was just Perla's front room and a handful of neighborhood kids and the smell of beans on a stove. I'll pay it, he said. He wrote the check out of the savings account, which had $6,240 in it, most of what was left after the funeral, and paying $1,840 of it out felt less like a decision than like setting down one heavy thing to pick up another. The clerk gave him a receipt and a form to sign that said he understood the building was released to him in its present condition, with all its hazards and all its liabilities, and that the city assumed no responsibility for anything found within. He signed it. He did not read the last line closely. Nothing found within. He thought there was nothing within but the ruined furniture of a poor woman's charity, and dust, and whatever animals had gotten in. He drove home with the receipt on the passenger seat, and a set of keys the clerk had produced from a manila envelope in the file. 3 keys on a loop of wire, and he did not go down to the building that day either. He sat in his own quiet house, and looked at the keys on the kitchen table, and thought about the porch and the light, and his wife's hand letting go of a child's hand. And he could not have said, if you had asked him, why he had just spent $1,800 on a place he had never once walked his own daughters into. He went down on Saturday morning, early before the heat, with a flashlight and a crowbar, and a box of contractor bags in the bed of the truck. The truck was a 2009 Silverado, with 191,000 miles on it. And it was the only thing besides the house that was fully his. And he backed it up over the cracked apron of the daycare's little parking lot and sat for a minute with the engine ticking. Up close the building was worse, and better than it had looked from the street. Worse because he could see the rot now, the black stains running down from the roofline, the way the plywood over the windows had pulled its own screws half out. Better because the brick under all of it was good brick, laid by somebody who had cared, and the porch, when he stepped up onto it, held his weight without a sound. Somebody had built this to last. Somebody had meant it to be here a long time. The 3 keys were for the front door, 2 deadbolts, and the knob, more locks than a poor woman's daycare had any reason to have. Ernie worked them one at a time. The last bolt was stiff, and he had to lean on it. And then the door swung in on a room that smelled of dust and mouse, and underneath that, very faintly, of crayon and paste, the smell every one of those rooms has and never quite loses. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. It was the main room, and it had been left the way a room is left when someone thinks they are coming back. Little tables, the kind that come up to a grown man's knee, were pushed together in the center with the chairs stacked on top, upside down, legs in the air, the way a teacher stacks them at the end of a day so the floor can be swept. Along one wall was a low bookshelf still full of books, swollen and warped with the damp, their spines gone soft. A calendar hung by the door, turned to a month 2 years past. On a corkboard, someone had pinned children's drawings, and the drawings had faded to almost nothing. Sun and time bleaching the crayon until they were just ghosts of houses and suns and stick people holding hands. But they were still pinned, still hung, still waiting for the mothers who had never come to take them down. Ernie walked through it slowly. He was a man who had spent his working life walking into rooms that other people ran out of. And he had learned to read a room the way you read a face. And what this room told him was that it had not been abandoned. It had been closed. There was a difference, and he felt it in his chest before he could have named it. An abandoned place is a place people fled. A closed place is a place someone shut carefully behind them, meaning to come back, and then could not. Off the main room were 2 smaller ones. A little kitchen, with a stove and a deep sink low enough for children, and cabinets he opened to find plastic cups stacked in towers, and a shelf of canned goods so old the labels had lost their color. And across from it, the nap room. He knew it was the nap room before he saw the mats. It was the darkest room, windowless, meant to be dark, with a strip of foam mats rolled and stacked in one corner, and along the far wall, a run of wooden cubbies, 30 of them, each with a faded strip of masking tape where a name had been written in marker. He shone the light along them. Some of the names had bled to nothing, some he could still read. Destiny, Marcus. And near the end, in a hand he did not recognize but in letters that stopped his breath, Alexa D. and 2 cubbies down, Eliana D. his daughter's names. Written by a woman he had barely known and kept and never taken down. Ernie stood in the dark with the light on those 2 strips of tape for a long time. He thought about all the mornings he had not been there. He thought about Samantha walking them down this street, and this woman writing their names on tape, and pressing it to a wooden cubby so that a 4-year-old could find her own place to put her shoes. He had paid for those years. He had bought them with his absence, 3 states away, and here was where they had been spent, and he had never once seen the room. He might have left then. He had what he came for, in a way, proof that the place was as dead and as sad as he'd expected. But firefighters do not leave a room until they have checked the whole room. And so he ran the light along the back wall, the one behind the cubbies, and that was when he saw that the wall was wrong. It was newer than the others. The rest of the interior walls were old plaster over lath, cracked and water-stained, painted 100 times. This one stretch of wall, behind the run of cubbies, was brick. Modern brick laid in a running bond, the mortar joint struck clean, and it did not go all the way to the ceiling, but stopped at a line about 7 feet up, where it met the old plaster in a seam somebody had tried and failed to hide. It had been painted over to match, the same institutional cream, but you could see it. Somebody had bricked up a section of wall, maybe 4 feet wide, from the floor to that seam, and then pushed the cubbies in front of it, and painted the whole thing, so that a person glancing through would see only a wall behind some shelves. Ernie set his hand flat against the brick. It was cool. He knocked on it once, and it gave back the dead flat sound of brick with something behind it, not the ring of brick against dirt. There was a space back there. Somebody had gone to a great deal of trouble to close off a space in the back of a nap room, in the dark, where no child would ever wonder about it, and then had died with the trouble still standing. He did not have the tools for it that day. He stood a while longer with his hand on the wall. Then he closed the building, all 3 locks, and drove home, and that night he did not sleep, which was nothing new, but for the first time in a long while, it was not his own life he lay awake inside of. It was hers. He came back Monday with a demolition bar, a 3-pound hammer, a cold chisel, and a respirator, because a man does not open a 2-year sealed space in the dark without a respirator. He pulled the cubbies out first and set them in the main room. Careful, because his daughter's names were on 2 of them. Then he went at the mortar joints. Whoever had laid the brick had known what they were doing, and it took him the better part of the morning. He worked 1 brick loose at the top corner, and then the next was easier, and the ones after that easier still, and the dust came off the mortar in a fine gray flour that hung in the flashlight beam. It was slow, dirty, honest work, and it was the best he had felt in months. He was sweating through his shirt. His back, the back the city had retired him for, set up its low complaint and he ignored it. By noon he had a hole he could put his head and shoulders through, and he leaned in with the light. It was not a room. It was more of a closet, a space maybe 4 feet deep and the width of the bricked section, and it had been a doorway once. He could see the old frame that somebody had chosen to seal rather than to lock. And it was dry. That was the first thing that struck him, that the air inside was dry and still and cool, and he understood why when the light found the little vent high in the corner, a passive vent screened against insects, and the packets of desiccant, dozens of them, laid along the shelves. She had built a space to keep paper in. Someone who wanted to keep paper alive in a Texas that ran to 100 degrees for a third of the year had built herself a dry little vault in the back of a nap room and bricked it shut. The shelves were full of ledgers. They were the old kind, cloth-bound, the tall, narrow columnar books a bookkeeper used before there were computers, and there were rows of them, and each spine had a strip of tape with a span of years in the same careful hand that had written his daughter's names. Ernie counted the spines with the light. The earliest said a year he had to look at twice, because it was the year he turned 14, the year of the beans on the stove. The latest ended 2 years back, 40 years, give or take, of narrow cloth-bound books. Standing in a dry, dark room that a woman had sealed behind a wall, he took the first one down with both hands. He carried it out to the porch where there was light, and sat on the top step with the book on his knees and opened it, and for a while he did not understand what he was looking at. It was a ledger, ruled in columns, and down the left side ran names, mothers' names, he realized, family names, a whole neighborhood of them, and across the top ran the weeks of the year. And in the little boxes where the names met the weeks were the same 2 figures over and over. In one column, $1. In the next column, wider, a real number, and the real numbers were not small. It took him most of an hour on that porch step, and a second book, and a third, before he let himself understand it. Because a man does not want to understand a thing that is going to cost him, the way this was going to cost him. Miss Perla had charged them $1 a week. That was the first column, $1. Every family, every child, $1 a week, and she had marked it paid in her own hand, week after week, year after year. And the second column, the wider one, was what it actually cost, what the food cost, and the light and the water, and the woman she hired for a while to help, and the insurance, and all of it, worked out per child, per week, in a bookkeeper's patient hand. She had written down the true price of the thing next to the dollar she charged for it, every week for 40 years, so that there could be no mistake, no fooling herself, about what she was doing. And then, at the bottom of each page, she had carried the difference forward into a column of her own, and the column had a heading, and the heading was 3 words. What I owe. Not what she was owed, what she owed. Ernie sat on the step with the book open on his knees, and the sun coming up over the drainage easement, and he ran the numbers the way he ran everything, without meaning to. $1 a week was $52 a year. The true cost, in the last books, the books from recent years, ran to something near $500 a week per child. Near $25,000 a year, the number he had heard on the news and not believed, the number that was the reason there were no children on Poplar Street, the number that had sent the young families running to wherever a person could still afford to have both a job and a child. $25,000 a year per child, and she had charged $52 and made up the rest herself, out of a life nobody could see the shape of for 40 years. He did not know yet how she had made up the rest. That was still behind another wall. But he knew, sitting there, that the town had gotten Perla Escobedo exactly wrong. They had called her the poor lady who watched kids. He had a book on his knees that said she was the richest person the street had ever had, and had spent all of it quietly, $1 at a time, on other people's children. And it was not only the dollar. He read on, and he found that the ledgers were not just money. In the margins, in that same careful hand, Perla had kept notes, small and dated, and the notes were the real record of what she had been running down at the end of the street. Against one family's line in a lean year she had written, "No dollar this month, do not ask." Against another, over several weeks, took the baby nights too. Mother working double at the plant. Once, beside a name Ernie half remembered, a boy who had grown up and gone into the army, sent lunch home with him Fridays, family short. She had noted a mother who could not read, and beside her name kept a private column of the forms she filled out for her, the school papers and the clinic papers, so the woman would never have to say aloud that she could not do it herself. She had written down which children needed glasses and which of those had gotten them and how. She had recorded, without any apparent sense that it was remarkable, 40 years of a neighborhood's small emergencies, met one at a time, by one woman, for $1 a week or for nothing, and she had never once, in any book, in any margin, written down a word of complaint or a word of praise for herself. The book simply said what was needed and what she had done about it, and turned the page, and did it again. Ernie found the Delgado line without looking for it, and when he found it his hands went still. It was in the early books, the ones from before the daycare was a daycare. Against his own family's name, at the very start of the earliest book, Perla had written 4 words he read 3 times before he let himself take them in. Rosa's boy. Watch him free. He did not understand yet everything that meant, but he understood that his own name was in these books too, near the beginning, and that whatever she had been doing for 40 years, she had started it, in part, with him. He was still on the step when Fernando Vega came down the sidewalk. Fernando was 71, retired off the railroad, and he had watered his strip of grass and then, seeing the truck, walked the length of the block to see what the man who left was doing down at the old daycare. Patricia came with him, in her yard hat, and they stood at the bottom of the steps, and Fernando looked at the crowbar and the dust all over Ernie and the open book on his knees. "They're going to knock it down," Fernando said. It was not quite a question. "No," Ernie said, "they're not." He turned the book around so they could see it. "I bought it." Fernando came up one step and looked at the page, at the columns of $1 a week, and the wide column beside it, and the 3 words at the bottom. He was quiet a long time. Patricia came up beside him. She had known Perla 40 years. Her own children had gone through that door, and her grandchildren, before her children took the grandchildren to Albuquerque and San Antonio, and did not come back. "We knew she didn't charge much," Patricia said finally. Her voice had gone careful. "We didn't know it was $1. She put her hand to her mouth. $1. All those years, we thought. Fernando, we thought she just didn't need the money. We thought she had her husband's pension." Perla's husband had been gone 30 years. Nobody had ever asked what she lived on. It had been easier to decide she was fine. Fernando sat down on the step next to Ernie, slow the way a big man sits down when his knees are gone, and he looked out at the empty playground with the chains and no swings. "My grandkids went here," he said, "both of them. Danny Cortez went here, and his daddy before him. Every kid on this street." He shook his head slowly. $25,000 a year. That's what ran them all off. "Danny told me, you know Danny on the corner, him and Nadia and the little one. Danny told me last spring they were done. They were moving to Boise because they ran the numbers, and they could not have the boy and both keep working. Not here, not with what the daycare over on Alameda charges." He looked at the book. "And this whole time there was a woman at the end of the street who'd have done it for $1, if she'd still been alive to do it." They sat there, the 3 of them, on the porch of the building the city meant to tear down, and none of them said the next thing, which was that the young families had run from a bill a dead woman had already been paying, and had never known it because she had never told a soul. Fernando came back the next morning without being asked, in his work clothes, and Patricia came with a thermos and a chair, and after that Ernie was not working alone anymore. That was how the block worked, or how it had worked once, before it emptied out. You did not ask. You just showed up with your own gloves. They carried the ledgers out one at a time and laid them on the little tables in the main room in order of their years. 40 years of narrow cloth books in a long row, and it took 2 days. And Ernie read pieces of them aloud, while Fernando swept and Patricia wiped down the tables she had cleaned for church suppers in that same room 30 years before. It was on the second day, moving the last of the cubbies back against the wall, that Ernie found the hatch. He had set the run of cubbies aside to open the brick, and now that the vault was open and emptied, he went to slide them back into place, and one of them, the heavy corner unit, would not sit flat. It rocked. He got down on his knees with the light to see what it was rocking on, and he saw that the floor under the cubbies was not the same floor as the rest of the room. The nap room had a poured concrete slab under thin carpet like the whole building. But here, in a square maybe 3 feet on a side, right where the cubbies had stood, the concrete had been cut, and a steel plate set into it. Flush, and the carpet laid back over so that with the cubbies on top of it, No one would ever have set foot on the seam. He pulled the carpet back. It was a hatch. A steel plate with a lip, the kind of thing you'd cover a cellar or a storm shelter with, set into a steel frame that had been grouted into the slab. There was no handle and no hinge that he could find, and when he pried at the edge with the bar it did not move at all, not a hair, and then he ran the light along the seam and understood why. It had been welded shut. A continuous bead of weld ran the whole way around the plate, joining it to its frame, laid by someone who did not want it opened by anything short of a decision. A bricked wall you could talk yourself into being a repair. A welded hatch in the floor, under the cubbies, under the carpet, was not a repair. It was a message. It said, "What is down here is worth more than what is behind the wall." He did not have a way to open it. You do not cut a weld with a crowbar. He sat back on his heels and looked at it, and Fernando came and looked at it, and it was Fernando who said his nephew ran a fence welding shop over off Loop 12 and had a grinder that would take that bead off in 20 minutes. The nephew came Saturday. His name was Marco, and he was 30, and he brought an angle grinder and a box of cut-off wheels and a face shield, and he asked no questions, because Fernando had told him it was for the old daycare, and on that street that was enough. He ran the grinder around the weld bead, and the sparks came off in a bright orange fan in the dim room, and the smell of hot steel filled the place, and it took not 20 minutes but closer to an hour, because whoever had welded it well. Then Marco set the grinder down and worked the point of a pry bar under the lip, and the plate came up with a sound like a held breath letting go. Cool air came out of the hole. Dry, again she had done the same thing here, a sealed dry space, and under the plate was a short set of concrete steps going down into a chamber the size of a small root cellar, and it was lined, floor to ceiling, with steel filing drawers. Ernie went down first with the light. The chamber was maybe 6 feet deep, cool the way ground stays cool, and along both walls ran the drawers, and each drawer had a paper label and a brass holder, and the labels were addresses. Not names, addresses. He read them in the beam. 412 Poplar, 418 Poplar, 425 Poplar, 431. The whole street, both sides, address after address, and cross streets too, Willow and Sabine and the near end of Alameda. Drawer after drawer of addresses on a street where half the houses stood empty. He opened the drawer labeled 412 Poplar. Inside was a deed. It was a warranty deed, recorded, with the county stamp on it, transferring the property at 412 Poplar Street from a family named Okonkwo. He half remembered them. They had gone to Milwaukee years back, to a grantee, and the grantee was not Perla Escobedo. The grantee was something called the Little Willows Community Land Trust. He stood there with the deed in his hand and did not yet know what those words meant, only that they were on every deed in the drawer, and there were a great many drawers. He learned what they meant over the next week. Slowly, because there was a lot of paper, and Ernie was not a lawyer. But the shape of it came clear, and the shape of it was this. As the families left, as the Okonkwos went to Milwaukee and the Riveras to Boise and the Salazars all the way to San Jose, as the young people ran the $24,000 arithmetic and gave up and went to Star, Idaho, and Albuquerque, to anywhere a paycheck could still hold up a family, the houses they left behind should have gone the way houses go on a street like that, bought cheap by men who lived somewhere else, rented out and let run down, or held empty and let rot, or scraped off and the lots flipped to whoever would pay the most. That was the future Poplar Street was owed. That was what happened to a street once the families ran. It had not happened here, because every time a house came empty and went up for sale quietly, before a speculator could get to it, someone had bought it and put it into the trust. He could see how it had gone, drawer by drawer, because Perla had kept the record of that too. The Salazar house, 425 Poplar, was the one that made it plain to him. The Salazars had gone to San Jose the year the little boy started school, because both parents had work but neither could leave it to be home, and the daycare had been shut a year by then. Perla too old and too sick to run it anymore, and there was no one. Their house went up for sale that fall. The listing was in the drawer, clipped to the deed, and clipped behind that was a cashier's check stub and a closing statement, and the price Perla had paid was the full asking price, not $1 less, because, Ernie understood this slowly, she had not wanted to be a woman who profited off a family's leaving. She had paid them fair and taken the house and moved it into the trust the same week, so that when the next young family came looking, they would find a house on Poplar Street they could actually afford, held forever below what the market would have charged. She had done that again and again, house after house, the drawers full of the record of it. A good part of the whole street, bought at full price out of a daycare, by a woman the town had decided was poor. Where all of it had come from was in a drawer of its own, on the low shelf, and it was the plainest thing in the cellar. Perla's family had come off a stretch of dry ranch land, west of the county 2 generations back. Land not worth farming and sold off long ago, but they had kept the minerals under it, the way old Texas families sometimes did without quite knowing why. And somewhere in the years after her husband died, the wells out there had finally come in. There was a folder of lease statements going back 30 years. A royalty check every month from a company Ernie had never heard of, never large, never the kind of money that buys a person a new car or a look at the country club, but steady, month after month, decade after decade, paid to a woman who lived on almost nothing and gave the rest away $1 at a time. That was what she had lived on. That was what had made up the difference and bought the houses at asking and quietly carried the street. Nobody had ever asked, because she had made very sure there was nothing to see, and the trust was the thing. Ernie read the trust document 3 times, and then he took it to a woman at the legal aid office downtown. A young lawyer named Priya Anand who did not charge him, and she read it and put it down and looked at him for a moment before she spoke. "Do you understand what this is?" she said. "I'm starting to," Ernie said. "This is a community land trust," Priya said. "A real one, filed and recorded, done right. Better than done right, done by somebody who thought about every way it could go wrong." She turned the pages. "The land is held by the trust permanently. It can't be sold at market. It can't be flipped. The trust holds the ground, and a family owns the house and pays almost nothing for the dirt under it forever. And when they sell to the next family at a price the trust controls. So it stays affordable, so it can never turn into money for somebody who was never going to live here." She looked up, "And it's irrevocable." She locked it. She built it so that not even she could undo it, later if somebody leaned on her, so that after she was gone, nobody could come along and unlock it and cash it out. She laid her hand flat on the document. "Mr. Delgado," she said, "there are city governments that have tried to do this and failed. There are foundations with lawyers on staff that have not done it this clean. This woman did it herself, deed by deed, over what looks like 30 years, out of a daycare, and she did not tell anyone, and she got it right." Priya shook her head slowly. "The poor lady who watched kids," she said, because Ernie had told her that was what the street had called Perla, quietly took 24 lots off the open market and locked them, so that Poplar Street could still be a place a young family could afford to live. And then she bricked up the proof and welded it under the floor and died without telling a soul. Ernie sat in the legal aid office and thought about Danny and Nadia Cortez on the corner with the little boy packing for Boise, and he thought, they don't have to go. There was a woman who made it so they don't have to go. They just never knew she'd done it. If you have made it this far into Ernie Delgado's story, take a second and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The last drawer in that cellar had his own name on it, and a man in a gray suit was already on his way to Poplar Street to try to take all of it apart. The last drawer was at the bottom of the run, on the end wall, and its brass label did not hold an address. It held a name, Delgado. Ernie had walked past it 3 times before it registered. Because his eyes were reading the street, and his own name was not the name of a house on the street, and then it registered all at once, and he stood very still in the cool of the cellar, and did not open it for a long moment. When he did, there was a single folder inside, thick, tied with butcher's twine gone soft, and clipped to the front of it was a note, and the note was to him. Ernesto, it said. Nobody had called him Ernesto since his mother died. "Ernesto, if you are reading this, then you finally came home, and I am sorry it took my dying to bring you. There are things I tried to tell you. You were never here to answer the door. Read all of it. Perla." He carried the folder up the concrete steps and out to the porch, into the light, the way he had carried the first ledger, and he sat on the same step and untied the twine. On top was a photograph, black and white, scalloped edges, gone brown at the corners, and it was of a young woman standing on the porch of a house Ernie knew, because it was the porch of his own house, 20 years younger, and the young woman was his mother. Rosa Delgado, maybe 25 in the picture, thin, in a work dress, and on her hip was a baby, and Ernie knew without being told that the baby was him. And standing next to his mother, an arm around her shoulders, laughing at whatever was off the edge of the picture, was another young woman, dark-haired, in an apron, and that one was Perla. He had not known they knew each other young. He had thought Perla was just the woman on the porch, from the afternoons, the beans on the stove. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in his mother's hand, faded pencil. Rosa and Perla. The day Perla first took Ernesto so I could work. And the year was the year Ernie was born. Under the photograph were the letters. There were a lot of them, and they were to him, and they were not old. They ran across the last 8 years, 1 or 2 a year, and they had all been mailed to the house on Poplar Street, certified, addressed to him alone and needing his signature, and they had all come back. Ernie turned them over and saw the yellow stickers on every one. Returned to sender, unclaimed. She had wanted them to reach no hand but his, and his was never there to sign. So year after year they went back. He had been 3 states away, sleeping in a bunk, and Samantha had been sick those last years and had let the mail pile up in a basket by the door, and then had not been able to get up to the door at all. And the letters a woman down the street kept mailing him had gone to the house and waited and gone back, year after year, and he had never once known they existed. He read them in order. They started gently. The first ones just asked him to come by, to sit with her, said she had something of his mother's to give him. When he did not come, when the letters came back, the next one said more. And then, in the 4th or 5th year, when she must have understood he was never going to walk up her steps, she stopped asking him to come and simply told him, on paper, the thing she had wanted to say to his face. Rosa Delgado had been the first mother Perla ever helped. Before the daycare, before any of it, when they were both young women on the same street and Rosa's husband had gone, and Rosa had a baby and a night job cleaning offices and no one to leave the child with, Perla had taken the baby. For nothing. Because they were neighbors and it was the right thing, and because, Perla wrote, your mother was the first person on this street who was ever kind to me, and I did not forget it. When Rosa was dying, Ernie had been young then, barely grown. She had made Perla one promise, and Perla had made her one back. And the promise was that Perla would look after the Delgados, whatever came, and Rosa could go easy. And then the letters told him what looking after had meant. And Ernie read it and set the page down on his knee and looked out at the empty playground for a long time. 20 years ago, when Rosa died and left the house to Ernie and Samantha, the house had come with a mortgage they could not carry. Ernie had been a young firefighter, making young firefighter money in a city that did not pay its firefighters much. And the numbers had not worked, and they had been weeks from losing the house his mother had bled to keep. And that was when Ernie had taken the job 3 states away, the firehouse that paid nearly double, and had begun the 20 years of Mondays out and Fridays home, of watching his daughters grow up in photographs, because it was the only way he could see to make the payment. He had never told anyone how close it had been. He had been ashamed of it, the way men are ashamed of the times the arithmetic beat them. But Perla had known. Perla knew everything that happened on that street. And Perla had made a promise to a dying woman. So, the letter said, plainly, the way you tell a hard thing at last. She had gone to the bank, quietly that first year, and she had bought the note on the Delgado house. Bought the mortgage outright, so that the lender the Delgados owed was no longer a bank but Perla Escobedo. And then she had done a thing so quiet that no one, not even Samantha, ever saw it. She had kept the monthly payment exactly the same, exactly what the bank had charged, so that nothing on any statement ever looked any different, and every dollar the Delgados sent she had logged and set aside, and never spent on herself and never needed, because in her own books, on the first day she bought that note, she had marked the whole thing forgiven. Paid. Owed nothing. The Delgados had not owed a bank for 20 years. They had been paying a neighbor who had already forgiven the debt, and who had taken every dollar of it and folded it, quietly, into the trust, into the lots, into the deeds, into keeping Poplar Street a place a family could afford, so that Ernie's 20 years of exile, the years that cost him his daughter's childhoods and his wife's last good health, had bought something after all. Just not what he thought. Not a roof over his own family. He had never needed to buy that. Perla had already paid for it, out of a debt to his mother, before he ever packed a bag. He could have stayed home. That was the thing at the bottom of the folder, under the photograph and the letters, the thing he had crossed 3 states in 20 years to not know. The house was safe the whole time. He could have taken the small job and the small money and been on the porch every morning when Samantha walked the girls down to the daycare, could have been the one to let go of their hands. And it would have been fine, the house would have stood, because a woman he barely thanked had already made it so. She had tried to tell him, 8 years of letters, everyone come back. You were never here to answer the door. The last thing in the folder was a legal document, and Ernie did not fully understand it until he took it to Priya, but it was a release, a satisfaction of the Delgado mortgage, signed by Perla, dated, notarized, and never filed. She had never recorded it. She had wanted, the note clipped to it said, to put it in his hand herself. To watch his face when he understood he was free, and had been free a long time. She had wanted that one thing for herself, after 40 years of wanting nothing, and he had never come, and so it had sat in a folder in a welded cellar with his name on the drawer, waiting. Ernie was still sitting on the step with the folder in his lap when the gray Audi came up Poplar Street and stopped in front of the daycare, and a man got out. He was maybe 45, in a gray suit with no tie, and he had the easy, warm way of a man who sells things for a living, and he came up the walk with his hand already out. Connor O'Brien, he said. He had a card. He did a lot of work in the neighborhoods on this side of the city, he said. Revitalization, and he'd heard the old daycare had changed hands, and he wanted to introduce himself before things went any further, neighbor to neighbor. Ernie shook his hand because his mother had raised him to. He did not say anything, which was a thing he had learned in 20 years of firehouses, that you can learn more from a man by not filling the silence he leaves. O'Brien filled it. He talked about the street, how sad it was, how much potential, how a block like this just needed someone with vision and capital to bring it back. He talked about the empty houses. He mentioned lightly that he had already been in touch with the families who'd left, the Riveras out in Boise, the Salazars in San Jose, that he'd been buying up interests here and there, assembling he called it, and that he had big plans for Poplar, and then he got to it, the way a man gets to it once he thinks he has warmed you up. There was, he understood, some old paperwork. Some kind of trust an elderly woman had set up before she passed. He wanted Ernie to know, kindly, one neighbor to another, that it wasn't going to hold. That the poor old thing had clearly not been in her right mind at the end, that a court would see that in about 5 minutes, and that O'Brien's lawyers were already preparing to have the whole trust set aside on the grounds that the woman who made it hadn't the capacity to know what she was doing. He said it gently. He said it the way you tell someone their lottery ticket is a fake, so they don't get their hopes up. I'd hate to see you spend money fighting it, O'Brien said. That's all. Take the building if you want it. Fix it up, sell it to me. Walk away with something in your pocket. But the lots aren't yours, friend, and they're not the neighborhood's either. They belong to a confused old woman who's gone now, and they're going to belong to whoever the court gives them to. He smiled. That's just how it works. Ernie looked at him for a while. Fernando had come up the walk by then and was standing at the bottom of the steps with his arms crossed, and Patricia behind him, and O'Brien had noticed them and did not much care. She wasn't confused, Ernie said. It was the first thing he'd said. O'Brien spread his hands, sympathetic. I'm sure she was a lovely woman, but a woman who lets her own building fall down around her, gives away her services for free, has no money, watches kids for 40 years for nothing. Mr. Delgado, I've seen it 100 times. That's not a sound mind. That's an old woman nobody looked after, making a mess for the courts to clean up. My people will show she didn't understand her own finances, and it'll be over. And there it was. And Ernie understood, sitting on the step with the folder in his lap, exactly how a man like O'Brien would lose. Not to a better lawyer, not to a louder voice, to the ledgers, because O'Brien was going to walk into a courtroom and say that Perla Escobedo had not understood her own finances. And Ernie was going to set 40 years of columnar books on the table. The true cost of childcare worked out to the penny, per child, per week, next to the dollar she charged, carried forward under a heading that said what I owe. And let a judge decide whether that was the arithmetic of a woman who did not understand money. He was going to lay out the deeds, 24 of them. Each one bought the week a house came empty, each one recorded and clean, and the trust document that a legal aid lawyer had called cleaner than the ones foundations paid firms to write. And he was going to let O'Brien try to stand in front of all of it and call the woman who did it senile. Perla had left the proof of her own mind, bricked into a wall and welded under a floor. Ernie understood now that she had not hidden it to keep it secret. She had hidden it to keep it safe, to keep it out of the hands of exactly this man, until the day someone came home who would open it in the light. "You should go," Ernie said. Not angry. He was not going to give O'Brien anger. Anger was the one thing that could have helped him, could have made this a fight between two men instead of what it was. "You can send your lawyers. I've got some papers of my own." O'Brien looked at him a moment longer, recalculating, and then he smiled again. Smaller, and got back in the gray car and drove off Poplar Street. And Ernie sat and watched him go and felt none of the things a man is supposed to feel about an enemy. Perla had spent 40 years not fighting anybody. He was not going to start a fight in her name. He was just going to open the door and turn on the light. That was in the end exactly how it went, and it did not take lawyers so much as it took witnesses. Priya Anand took the case for nothing, because she said she had waited her whole career for a set of records this good. But the records did most of the work themselves. When O'Brien's firm filed to have the trust set aside, capacity, they called it, lack of capacity, the polite courthouse word for what he'd said on the porch, Priya did not answer with argument. She answered with the ledgers, all 40 years of them, entered into the record, and with the deeds, and with the trust instrument, and with something O'Brien's people had not counted on, which was the street. Because Ernie did the thing Perla never had. He told people. He and Fernando went door to door on Poplar and on Willow and Sabine, to the houses that still had someone in them, and they drove out to see the ones who had left, and they made phone calls to Boise and to San Jose and to Star, Idaho, and to Milwaukee, and they said, "Come tell what she did for you." And the people came, or they wrote it down and swore to it, and there were more of them than anyone on Poplar had understood. A whole generation of mothers who had been able to keep a job because $1 a week bought their child a safe place from 6 in the morning. Grown men and women, scattered across the country now, who had been the children on those faded drawings, who remembered the porch and the beans and the woman who caught them when they ran. The Cortez family, the Vegas grandchildren. Danny Cortez himself, who had gone to that daycare and had been 3 days from moving his own boy to Boise, standing up in a courthouse to say what the poor lady who watched kids had really been. There was a hearing one morning in February in a courtroom downtown that smelled of floor wax and old radiators, and it did not go the way O'Brien's lawyers had planned, because they had planned for a fight about a document, and what they got was a room full of people. The judge was a woman near 60 who had grown up, it turned out, 3 streets over from Poplar, and she let them all speak. Patricia Vega stood up and told the court she had known Perla Escobedo 40 years, and had never once seen her forget a child's name or a child's allergy or the exact day a family had fallen behind, and that if that was what a woman who did not understand her own affairs looked like, the court could make more of them. A man in a delivery uniform, who had driven in from 2 hours away on his day off, said he had been one of the children on those faded drawings, that Perla had taught him to read in that nap room, and that he had a daughter now and he had driven all this way to say so. Danny Cortez stood up last. He was not a man used to speaking in rooms like that, and he held his hat. And he said that he had been 3 days from packing a truck for Boise, that he had done the math 100 times. And there was no version where he could keep his job and his wife could keep hers, and they could pay what a child cost in this city, and that he had learned only this winter that a woman he used to run to on a porch had spent 30 years quietly making it, so his boy could grow up on the same street he had. He said, "I didn't get to thank her." He sat down. The lawyer for O'Brien did not ask him any questions. You cannot call a woman senile in a room full of the lives she built. O'Brien's lawyers read the ledgers, and read the room, and did the arithmetic they were better at than any other, and withdrew the challenge before it ever reached a ruling. The trust held. It had been built to hold. She had made sure of that before any of them were born. Ernie did one more thing with the paperwork, and he did it alone, on a gray Tuesday, at the county recorder's office downtown. He took the satisfaction of mortgage that Perla had signed and dated and notarized and never filed, and he filed it. It cost him $12 to record. He stood at the counter while the clerk stamped it and time-stamped it and slid it back to him. And for the first time in 20 years, the house on Poplar Street belonged to nobody but him, free and clear, the way it had in fact belonged to him all along, and he found that he could not quite see the counter for a moment, and had to stand there until it passed. He drove home and he did not go into the empty house. He went down to the daycare instead. That was where he went now, when the quiet got to be too much. He had begun to think of it as the one room in Willows that was not quiet on purpose. Alexa came home that spring, on a break from school, and Ernie did a thing he had never done, which was ask his daughter to sit down and listen to him. He told her all of it. He told her about the $1 a week and the true cost and the column that said what I owe. He told her about the deeds and the trust and O'Brien and the courtroom. And then he told her the last part, the part he had not told anyone, not Fernando, not Priya, about the letters that came back and the note that was already forgiven, and the 20 years that had bought a roof that was already paid for. He told her that he had gone away for nothing, that he had missed her whole childhood and Eliana's whole childhood, missed her mother, for a debt that a woman down the street had quietly carried the entire time, and that the woman had tried to tell him for 8 years, and he had never been home to answer the door. He thought Alexa would be angry. He had earned her being angry. Instead, his 20-year-old daughter sat with it a while, and then she said, "So she was trying to give you back to us the whole time." And Ernie said he supposed that was one way to put it, and Alexa said it was the only way to put it, and then she cried, and then, after a while, so did he, which he had not done at the funeral, or at any of the counters, or on any of the porch steps, and it was the first honest thing the two of them had done together in a long time. They reopened Little Willows the following autumn. It took most of a year. The roof had to be redone, and the plywood came off the windows and glass went back in, and the black stains got scrubbed, and the good brick underneath came up clean the way Ernie had known it would. He did a lot of it himself, with his retired back and his firefighter's lungs, and Fernando did what his knees would let him. And Marco the welder came back on weekends, and Danny Cortez, who did not move to Boise after all, put in the new flooring in the nap room over the cellar, which they left as it was, empty now, the drawers moved up into a proper office. The hatch cover set into the floor and left unwelded, because there was no more need to weld anything shut on Poplar Street. The money came from the place Ernie had least expected it, and most deserved it. Priya worked out that the trust could fund the operation of the daycare directly. That Perla had, of course, thought of that too, had built it into the instrument, a provision for the education and care of the children of the trust's families, sitting there fully formed and waiting for someone to invoke it. And the money in it, the money that made the free daycare possible, was in no small part the 20 years of Delgado mortgage payments that Perla had folded away and never spent. Ernie understood, when Priya explained it, that the children of Poplar Street were going to be cared for free, on the money he had earned 3 states away in a firehouse bunk, mailing it home for a house that was already his. His exile had bought something after all. It had just taken 20 years and a welded hatch for anyone to see what. They did not charge $1 a week. They charged nothing, the way the trust allowed, but they hung the last of Perla's ledgers in a frame by the door, open to a page of $1-a-week columns, so that no child who grew up in that room would ever grow up not knowing what it had cost and who had paid it. They found a teacher, a young woman named Gloria, who had trained for it and could not find work at a wage a young teacher could live on, and the trust could pay her a fair one, and that was its own kind of arithmetic coming right. On the first morning, a Tuesday in September, Ernie was there before the light, the way he had been in another life, standing on the porch in the early cool. He did not know if anyone would come. The block party had been one thing, a day. A daycare was a thing families had to trust with a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and every day after. He stood on the porch with the door open behind him, and the lights on inside and coffee going cold in his hand. Then Nadia Cortez came down the sidewalk with Mateo, the way Samantha used to come down it with the girls, and Mateo let go of his mother's hand and ran the last of it and went up the steps past Ernie into the room, to the cubbies, where a strip of fresh masking tape with his name on it waited over a place for him to put his shoes. And behind them came another mother Ernie did not know, new to the street, with a smaller child on her hip, and behind her the light was coming up gold over the drainage easement, the way it had the morning he first read the ledger. Ernie stood on the porch and watched the children go in past him, one after another, the way you catch things thrown down to you from a great height, and he understood that he was standing where she had stood, doing the small piece of it that was his to do, and that this was what she had built the morning for, and that she had known 40 years ago that someone would eventually be here to open the door. The willow on the sign got repainted. A girl from the high school did it, Eliana's friend, and she matched the old yellow as close as the hardware store had, and under the willow she painted the words back in, Little Willows, And beneath that, small, where the old sign had never had anything, she painted a line Ernie asked her to add. Founded by Perla Escobedo. It was the first time the woman's name had ever been on the front of the building. She had run it 40 years and never once put her name on it. The block party came back that same autumn. It had been gone since the year the world shut its doors, and nobody had ever restarted it. Because there had been no one to restart it for, no children, no reason to close a street that no cars used anyway. But there were children now, not many yet. The Cortez boy, Mateo, who was 4, and 2 babies born that year to families who had heard, somehow all the way out in other states, that there was a street in Willows where a young family could still afford to live, and a place at the end of it that would watch your child for nothing, and had come or come back. It was a start. Perla had spent 40 years making a place for exactly this. One more young family, and then one more, and now they were coming, and she was not there to see it, and that was the shape of what she had done, that she had built a morning she would never stand in. They closed off Poplar between Willow and the Daycare. Somebody dragged out a grill. Patricia set up a folding table in the shade, and on it she and Fernando put out a cooler of juice boxes, the little foil-strawed kind. And they handed them to the children who came, one after another, the way you hand a thing down to someone smaller than you. Fernando, 71, kept a running count in his head of every kid who took one. And it made him happy in a way he could not have explained, because for 10 years the count would have been 0. And late in the afternoon, when the heat finally broke and the light went long and gold down the length of the street, Mateo Cortez got a scooter. It was his birthday, or near enough, and Danny had bought it, a little 2-wheeled scooter with a bell. And the boy rode it down the middle of Poplar Street, past the Daycare with its new roof and its old name freshly painted, past the houses that were not empty anymore, past Fernando and Patricia and their juice boxes, past Ernie Delgado standing on the porch of the building he had bought for $1,840 to have something to do with his hands. And the sound of the little bell went up and down the block, and it was the first scooter anyone had heard on that street in a decade. Ernie stood on the porch and watched the boy ride. Alexa was beside him, home for the party, and Eliana was down on the sidewalk, laughing at something with her friend who had painted the sign. And across the street, Fernando was counting juice boxes, and the light was gold. And somewhere in it, if you believed in that kind of thing, was a woman who had caught children when they ran and asked nothing, and told no one and paid quietly for all of it for 40 years. They had called him the man who left. He supposed some of them still did, and he supposed they had a right to. But he had come home in the end, and he had opened the door Perla left him, and behind it he had not found what he expected, which was proof of how little his life had come to. He had found the opposite. He had found that the whole time he thought he was carrying his family alone, 3 states away, a woman at the end of the street had been carrying them too, and the street with them, and had never once let it be seen, and that the debt she was paying was a kindness his own mother had done a frightened young neighbor before he was born. Nothing about Tech could be undone. He would not get the 20 years back, or Samantha, or the mornings on the porch. That was the true price, and the ledger of it had already been carried forward, and there was no column that would ever make it come out even. But the Daycare was open, and it was free, and there were scooters on Poplar Street, and a young family on the corner had a place to stay, and one more was coming, and one more after that. Perla had not left him money. She had left him the thing money is only ever a poor way of buying. A street where people looked after each other, and proof that his own family had always been part of it, and a job, at 54, worth getting up in the morning for. He went down the steps and out into the gold light to help Patricia with the juice boxes, and the bell on the scooter rang, and Ernie Delgado, the man who left, was home.